The marble floor of the Federal Bureau of Investigation headquarters stretched endlessly beneath Director Sarah Chen's polished black Oxfords, each step echoing through the corridors like a metronome marking time toward an inevitable confrontation. The weight of her badge, gold-plated and gleaming against her navy suit jacket, felt heavier today than it had during her swearing-in ceremony 3 months ago. Today she would face the ghosts of her past, wearing the armor of her present. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to our channel. The emergency briefing had come at 5:47 a.m., jarring her from the restless sleep that had become her constant companion since assuming the directorship. Deputy Director Marcus Williams had called with news that would have broken a lesser person. A domestic terrorism cell had been discovered operating out of her hometown of Millbrook, Pennsylvania, the same small town where her family had spent decades telling her she'd never be anything more than the difficult Chen girl who asked too many questions and dreamed too big. Sarah paused at the massive windows overlooking Pennsylvania Avenue, watching early morning commuters hurry past with their coffee cups and purpose-driven strides. Each person carried their own story of triumph or failure, but few carried the weight of proving an entire family wrong while simultaneously protecting the nation they'd sworn to serve. The irony wasn't lost on her that Millbrook's first federal emergency in 30 years would require her personal oversight. Director Chen? Agent Lisa Rodriguez appeared at her elbow, tablet in hand, and concern etched across her weathered features. Rodriguez had been with the Bureau for 15 years, had seen 3 directors come and go, and possessed an intuitive understanding of when her boss needed space versus when she needed support. This morning she offered support. The advance team confirms what we suspected. The cell has been operating for at least 18 months, possibly longer. They've been recruiting from local families experiencing economic hardship. Economic hardship. Sarah almost laughed at the clinical terminology. In Millbrook, they didn't call it economic hardship. They called it the way things are and what people like us deserve. Her father had worked the steel mill for 37 years before it closed, taking with it not just jobs, but the entire identity of a town that had defined itself by the rhythm of shift changes and the orange glow of furnaces against the night sky. When the mill died, something in the people died too, leaving behind a hollow space that anger and resentment seemed to fill with frightening ease. "How many families?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she knew at least some of the names that would appear on the list. 17 confirmed households: the Kowalski family, the Morettis, the... Rodriguez paused, consulting her tablet with the careful precision of someone delivering potentially devastating news. The Chens are listed as persons of interest. The coffee in Sarah's stomach turned acidic. Of course they were. Her brother Danny had always been drawn to easy answers and dangerous friends. Her parents had always been bitter about opportunities that seemed to flow toward other people's children, while their own remained trapped in a town that time had forgotten. The perfect storm of resentment, economic desperation, and wounded pride that extremist groups exploited with surgical precision. "Which Chens?" she asked, though her voice sounded distant even to her own ears. "Daniel Chen, age 34, unemployed for 8 months. Angela Chen, age 59, works part-time at the grocery store. Robert Chen, age 62, disability payments since the mill closure." Rodriguez's voice carried professional neutrality, but Sarah caught the underlying note of sympathy. There's no indication of direct involvement in planning any operations, but they've attended several meetings at the community center where recruitment was taking place. Sarah nodded, her mind already shifting into the compartmentalization that had carried her through law school at Georgetown, through her early years as a prosecutor, through her rapid rise within the Bureau's ranks. Personal feelings were a luxury she couldn't afford, especially when national security was at stake. But the human part of her, the part that still remembered being 12 years old and listening to her mother explain why she couldn't have new school clothes because money doesn't grow on trees, and girls like you need to learn that early, felt something crack inside her chest. The elevator arrived with a soft chime, and Sarah stepped inside with Rodriguez and 2 other members of her senior staff. Assistant Director James Park, a Korean-American man whose own family had immigrated to a small Minnesota town in the 1980s, understood something about being different in places where different meant dangerous. Special Agent Maria Santos had grown up in rural Texas, where being Latina and ambitious had marked her as either inspiration or threat, depending on who was doing the looking. The local field office has been monitoring the situation for 3 weeks, Park reported as they descended toward the parking garage where armored vehicles waited. They requested federal oversight when communications intercepts revealed planning for what appears to be an attack on the county courthouse. The symbolism is significant. It's where most foreclosure proceedings have been handled since the economic downturn. Sarah understood the symbolism better than her colleagues realized. The county courthouse was where her family had nearly lost their house in 2018, saved only by a last-minute intervention from her newfound FBI salary. The same courthouse where she'd won her first case as a prosecutor, defending a domestic violence victim against her abuser. The same courthouse where she'd been married and divorced, where she'd changed her name back to Chen because holding on to her identity felt more important than holding on to a marriage that had crumbled under the weight of her ambition, and his inability to understand why she couldn't just be satisfied with enough. Timeline for the operation, she asked, watching the suburban landscape of Virginia give way to the rural highways that would carry them toward her past. Intelligence suggests they're planning to move within the next 48 hours. The recruitment phase appears to be complete, and they've acquired enough materials to cause significant casualties. Santos consulted her briefing folder, her expression grim. The good news is that their operational security has been sloppy. The bad news is that they don't seem to care about getting caught, which suggests they're planning something big enough to justify the sacrifice. The concept of sacrifice wasn't foreign to Sarah. She'd sacrificed relationships, sleep, financial security, and countless personal moments to build her career. But she'd made those sacrifices by choice, driven by a vision of who she wanted to become, rather than by desperation over who she'd never be. The people she was driving toward had made different calculations, choosing destruction over construction, blame over responsibility. As the convoy moved through small towns that looked increasingly like Millbrook, weathered main streets, empty storefronts, American flags hanging from porches like prayers for better times, Sarah found herself thinking about the last conversation she'd had with her parents. It had been 6 months ago, just after her nomination to the directorship had been announced. Her mother had called, voice tight with an emotion that might have been pride or might have been resentment. "I saw you on the news," her mother had said, "looking all important in your fancy suit." "It's a big opportunity, Mom. I wanted you to hear it from me first." "Always did think you were too good for Millbrook, too good for your family." The accusation had stung because it carried a grain of truth wrapped in years of hurt feelings and unspoken disappointments. "I never thought I was too good for anyone," she'd replied. "I just wanted to be good enough for myself." The silence that followed had stretched across decades of miscommunication, lost opportunities, and the particular pain that exists between family members who love each other but can't seem to understand how they're supposed to fit together. Her father had taken the phone then, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated disappointment. "Your brother's struggling, Sarah. Lost his job at the warehouse. The wife left him, took the kids." He'd paused, and she could hear him breathing heavily, the sound of a man trying to find words for problems too big for simple solutions. He could use some help, not money. Pride won't let him take money from his sister, but maybe you could talk to him. Maybe you got connections. She'd promised to call Danny, but she hadn't. The truth was that every conversation with her family felt like stepping into quicksand, each word carefully measured to avoid triggering the resentment that seemed to simmer just beneath the surface of every interaction. They saw her success as something that had happened to her rather than something she'd earned, and she saw their struggles as choices rather than circumstances. The gap between those perspectives felt unbridgeable. Now, as the convoy approached the Millbrook exit, Sarah wondered if that gap had finally become dangerous. Had her brother's desperation and her parents' bitterness made them vulnerable to people who promised simple solutions to complex problems? Had their resentment toward a daughter who'd escaped made them susceptible to rhetoric about elites and outsiders who didn't understand real Americans? The irony was devastating. She'd spent her entire career protecting people like her family from threats both foreign and domestic. She'd worked counterterrorism cases, organized crime investigations, public corruption matters that had taken down senators and governors. She'd dedicated her life to the principle that justice was blind, that the law applied equally to everyone regardless of background or circumstances. And now she was driving toward a situation where that principle would be tested in the most personal way possible. "Director?" Rodriguez's voice broke through her thoughts. "We're 5 minutes out. The local command post has been established at the high school. Millbrook High School." Of course it had. The same high school where Sarah had been valedictorian, where she'd given a graduation speech about perseverance and believing in yourself despite what others might say about your potential. The same high school where her guidance counselor, Mrs. Patterson, had been the first person to suggest that Sarah might be college material, that her questions and her hunger for understanding weren't character flaws, but gifts to be developed. Mrs. Patterson would be retired by now, living somewhere warm with grandchildren who visited on holidays. She'd probably seen Sarah's appointment on the news, had probably felt a moment of pride in the girl who'd sat in her office 20 years ago asking if it was really possible for someone like her to become a lawyer. Sarah hoped so. She hoped that at least one person in Millbrook would understand that her success wasn't a betrayal of her roots, but a fulfillment of them. The high school came into view, its brick facade unchanged except for the addition of new security cameras and the temporary installation of federal command vehicles in the parking lot. Sarah could see agents moving with practiced efficiency, setting up communications equipment, reviewing tactical plans, preparing for whatever the next 48 hours might bring. They were good people doing important work, and she was proud to lead them, but she was also terrified of what they might be forced to do to people who shared her last name. Sarah's first memory of feeling different hadn't been about race or class or gender. It had been about questions. While other children in Mrs. Henderson's second-grade class accepted simple answers, Sarah had been the one raising her hand to ask, "But why? And what if? And how do we know that's true?" Her parents had initially been proud of their precocious daughter, but that pride had gradually transformed into embarrassment as teachers began using words like challenging and difficult, and, quote, perhaps too intense for other children. The transformation of her family's perception had been gradual but unmistakable. By middle school, Sarah's academic achievements had become sources of tension rather than celebration. When she won the county science fair, her mother had spent the dinner conversation talking about how some families don't appreciate show-offs and how fitting in matters more than standing out. When she'd been accepted into the National Honor Society, her father had muttered something about book smarts not being the same as common sense. But Sarah had developed strategies for survival. She'd learned to celebrate her victories privately, to seek validation from teachers and guidance counselors rather than family members, to build an identity separate from the one that felt so unwelcome at her own dinner table. She'd created a careful compartmentalization between the person she was at home, dutiful, unassuming, careful not to shine too brightly, and the person she was everywhere else. The morning routine that had carried her through high school had been precision itself. Wake at 5:30 a.m., study for an hour before the house stirred to life, shower and dress in clothes that were neat but not flashy, eat breakfast while reviewing notes, leave for school early enough to avoid the chaos of her brother's frantic search for homework he'd forgotten to do. At school, she'd been Sarah Chen, the student council president, the debate team captain, the girl who teachers pulled aside to ask about college applications and scholarship opportunities. At home, she'd been Sarah Chen, the daughter who tried not to mention her achievements too prominently. The contradiction had been exhausting. She'd learned to translate her experiences into language her family could accept. Instead of saying she'd won an academic award, she'd mentioned that she'd had to go to some ceremony thing at school. Instead of discussing her fascination with criminal justice and constitutional law, she'd describe her interest as maybe doing something with government work. She'd become fluent in diminishing herself, in making her light smaller so that others wouldn't feel overshadowed. College had been liberation from a family who saw her ambitions as betrayal. But the freedom to be fully herself had come with the price of increasing distance from her family, who seemed to view each semester as evidence that she was becoming someone they could no longer recognize or reach. Her sophomore year had brought the first major confrontation. She'd called home to share the news that she'd been selected for a summer internship with the Department of Justice, working on civil rights enforcement. The opportunity was competitive and prestigious, exactly the kind of experience that would set her up for law school and beyond. She'd expected, perhaps naively, that her parents would be proud. Civil rights? Her mother had repeated, the phrase hanging in the air like an accusation. What's that supposed to mean? I'll be working on cases involving discrimination, Mom, making sure people are treated fairly under the law. Fairly according to who? Sounds like you're learning to look down on regular people who work for a living. The conversation had deteriorated from there, with her father eventually getting on the phone to inform her that she was getting too big for her britches and that real Americans don't need the government telling them how to think. Sarah had hung up, feeling simultaneously heartbroken and furious, recognizing that her family had somehow come to see her career in law enforcement as a betrayal rather than service. Law school had deepened both her expertise and the chasm with her family. While she'd been studying constitutional law and criminal procedure, learning about the delicate balance between individual rights and collective security, her parents had been consuming a steady diet of media that portrayed federal law enforcement as an occupying army hostile to quote. Her brother Danny had dropped out of community college, bouncing between jobs and relationships with a growing sense of grievance about opportunities that seemed available to everyone except him. The irony had been painful and persistent. Sarah had chosen her career because she'd believed deeply in the principle that everyone deserved equal protection under the law, regardless of their background or circumstances. She'd wanted to be part of a system that ensured fairness, that protected the vulnerable, that held powerful people accountable when they abused their positions. But to her family, her work had represented exactly the opposite: an elite system that looked down on people like them, that imposed values they didn't share, that suggested their way of life was somehow insufficient or wrong. Her first assignment as a new FBI agent had been in the Detroit field office, working white-collar crime cases that involved pension fraud and mortgage scams. The irony hadn't escaped her that she was investigating the kinds of financial crimes that had devastated communities like Millbrook, pursuing justice for working families who'd had their retirements stolen or their homes foreclosed through predatory lending practices. She'd been doing exactly the work that should have made her family proud, but she'd learned not to discuss the details of her cases during her increasingly rare phone calls home. The pattern of their interactions had become predictable and painful. Her mother would ask what she was doing at work, and Sarah would offer vague responses about paperwork and investigations. Her father would make comments about how, quote, government jobs must be nice, with their fancy benefits and guaranteed paychecks. Danny would barely speak to her, treating her success as somehow directly responsible for his failures. But Sarah had persisted, driven by a sense of purpose that felt larger than family approval. She'd worked counterterrorism cases that had prevented attacks on American soil. She'd pursued organized crime figures who'd terrorized immigrant communities. She'd investigated public corruption that had stolen millions from school districts and municipal services. Each case had reinforced her belief that the law could be a force for justice, that institutions could serve people rather than exploit them, that her work mattered even if the people who'd raised her couldn't understand its value. The breakthrough in her career had come during her work on a domestic terrorism case involving a militia group that had been planning to bomb a federal courthouse in Michigan. The investigation had required her to understand the psychology of radicalization, to trace the pathways by which ordinary grievances could metastasize into violent extremism. She'd learned to recognize the warning signs: economic displacement, social isolation, exposure to ideologies that promised simple explanations for complex problems, gradual acceptance of violence as a legitimate response to perceived injustice. The knowledge had been professionally valuable and personally devastating. As she'd studied the case files and interviewed family members of the convicted terrorists, she'd recognized patterns that felt uncomfortably familiar. The resentment toward elites who seemed disconnected from ordinary struggles, the suspicion of institutions that claimed to serve everyone but seemed to benefit only some, the growing belief that the system was rigged against people like them, and that dramatic action might be necessary to reclaim their dignity and power. Her promotion to supervisor had come with increased responsibility for domestic terrorism cases, and Sarah had thrown herself into the work with an intensity that had cost her marriage and most of her friendships outside the bureau. She'd become expert at identifying the environmental factors that made individuals and communities vulnerable to extremist recruitment: economic desperation, social fragmentation, political polarization, media consumption that reinforced existing grievances while offering few constructive solutions. The expertise had been invaluable in her professional life, but it had cast a shadow over every interaction with her family. During their last Christmas together 2 years ago, she'd watched her father consume a steady stream of media that portrayed federal law enforcement as an enemy of ordinary Americans. She'd listened to her brother rant about government agencies that seemed more concerned with protecting criminals than victims. She'd bitten her tongue when her mother had expressed admiration for politicians who promised to drain the swamp and restore power to real Americans. The evening had ended with an argument that had started over something trivial, Sarah's suggestion that they watch a different news channel, and escalated into a confrontation that had laid bare years of accumulated resentment. Her father had accused her of thinking she was better than her family. Her mother had suggested that Sarah's job had corrupted her, made her forget where she came from. Danny had remained silent, but his expression had carried a mixture of anger and disappointment that had felt like a physical blow. "I never forgot where I came from," Sarah had said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I just didn't want to stay there forever." The silence that followed had felt final, like something breaking that couldn't be repaired. She'd left the next morning, earlier than planned, and hadn't been back to Millbrook since. The phone calls had become less frequent, more strained, limited to birthdays and holidays and obligatory check-ins that satisfied neither side. Her appointment as FBI Director had represented the pinnacle of a career built on principle and persistence, but it had also felt like the final step in a journey that had taken her impossibly far from the people who'd raised her. The day of her confirmation hearing, she'd sat in the Senate committee room, surrounded by colleagues and supervisors who'd believed in her potential, answered questions about her vision for the Bureau's future, outlined her commitment to protecting American values and American lives. But the 2 empty seats she'd reserved for her parents had remained unfilled, a visible reminder of the price she'd paid for refusing to accept their limitations as her own. The loneliness of leadership had been compounded by the loneliness of estrangement. Sarah had achieved everything she'd dreamed of as a young woman who'd refused to accept that her questions were too big and her ambitions too dangerous. But success felt hollow when the people who should have been proudest of her achievements had somehow become the people most threatened by them. Now, as she prepared to enter the command post at her old high school, Sarah carried with her not just the authority of her office, but the weight of unresolved family dynamics that had shaped every choice she'd made for 20 years. She was about to investigate people who shared her DNA, people whose grievances she understood, even if she couldn't accept their solutions. People who might see her arrival not as salvation, but as confirmation of everything they'd come to believe about the distance between their daughter and themselves. The command post buzzed with the controlled intensity of federal agents preparing for a complex domestic operation. Maps covered every available wall surface, marked with red pins indicating known cell member locations, blue pins for potential targets, and yellow pins for civilians who might be caught in any crossfire. Sarah studied the tactical displays with professional detachment, but her eyes kept returning to one particular cluster of pins on Maple Street, the street where she'd grown up, where her childhood bedroom window had faced the morning sun, where she'd spent countless afternoons reading on the front porch while dreaming of bigger worlds. Special Agent in Charge Tom Morrison approached with a grim expression and a thick folder of surveillance photographs. Morrison was a 22-year Bureau veteran who'd worked domestic terrorism cases across the Midwest, someone who understood the particular challenges of investigating extremism in small communities where everyone knew everyone else's business. He'd specifically requested this assignment after learning about the connection to Sarah's hometown, understanding that the optics and the personal stakes required careful handling. "Director, we've got developments," Morrison said, spreading the photographs across the conference table. Surveillance teams observed a gathering last night at the Millbrook Community Center. 17 individuals attended, including several from your family. He paused, studying her face for any reaction. The meeting lasted 3 hours. Audio quality from our directional microphones was poor due to wind conditions, but we caught fragments of conversation about taking action and sending a message that can't be ignored. Sarah picked up the surveillance photos, her trained eye cataloging faces and body language while her heart fought against the recognition of familiar features. There was Danny, thinner than she remembered, his face carrying the weathered look of someone who'd absorbed too many disappointments. Her father sat beside him, his posture rigid with the kind of anger that had become his default expression over the past decade. Her mother stood near the back of the room, arms crossed, wearing the same defensive stance that had characterized her approach to conflict for as long as Sarah could remember. "Any indication of specific targets or timeline?" she asked, forcing her voice to maintain professional neutrality. "The fragments we captured suggest they're planning to move during the county commissioners' meeting tomorrow morning. The courthouse will be crowded with citizens attending to voice concerns about property tax increases." Morrison consulted his notes. "Intelligence analysis suggests they view the tax issue as symbolic of government overreach, particularly given how many families have lost homes to foreclosure over the past 5 years." The tax issue. Sarah almost smiled at the clinical language being applied to what she knew was a deeply personal wound for almost every family in Millbrook. The county had been forced to raise property taxes to maintain basic services after the state had cut funding for rural communities. For families already struggling with unemployment and underemployment, the increase had felt like salt in an open wound, another example of government making their lives harder while offering no real solutions to their underlying problems. Agent Maria Santos approached with additional intelligence, her expression troubled. "Director, we've intercepted communications suggesting the group has acquired explosives. Not sophisticated devices, but enough ammonium nitrate and diesel fuel to cause significant casualties in a confined space like the courthouse." She handed Sarah a transcript of a text message conversation. "The concerning part is this exchange from last night. Someone using the handle, Patriot Dad 62, wrote, 'Time to show them what happens when you forget who really runs this country.' That phone number traces back to Robert Chen. Patriot Dad 62. Her father had been born in 1962, had called himself a patriot for as long as Sarah could remember, though his definition of patriotism had apparently evolved to include violence against the institutions he'd once respected. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Her own father was potentially planning to commit terrorism. The man who'd taught her to ride a bicycle, who'd attended her high school graduation, who'd once expressed pride in her choice to study law, was now discussing explosives and casualty counts. "What's our legal standing for arrests?" Sarah asked, though she knew the answer would be complicated. Attending meetings and expressing angry opinions fell well within First Amendment protections. Planning violence crossed into criminal conspiracy, but proving intent required evidence that might not yet exist in sufficient quantity to satisfy a federal prosecutor. Morrison exchanged glances with Santos before responding, borderline. "We have evidence of the group acquiring materials that could be used to construct explosive devices, but no direct evidence of completed devices or specific plans for deployment. The text messages suggest intent, but defense attorneys would argue they're just angry rhetoric rather than concrete threats." He paused. "However, given the quantity of materials involved and the proximity to tomorrow's public event, we have grounds for preventive arrests under domestic terrorism statutes." Preventative arrests. The phrase carried weight that extended far beyond its legal definition. Sarah was being asked to authorize the arrest of her family members based on evidence that was suggestive but not conclusive, intelligence that indicated potential rather than certainty. In her previous assignments, such decisions had been straightforward applications of law and policy. Now the decision felt like choosing between her oath of office and her blood relationships. "I need to understand their mindset," Sarah said, surprising herself with the words. "Before we move to arrests, I want to know what's driving this. What pushed them from angry conversation to actual planning?" The request was unusual, but not unprecedented. Understanding the psychology of domestic terrorists had become crucial to both prevention and prosecution efforts. But Sarah's colleagues recognized that her interest went beyond professional necessity. She was trying to understand how the people who'd raised her had evolved into people she barely recognized. Assistant Director Park pulled up additional files on his laptop. We've been tracking the progression for several months. It started with attendance at what appeared to be legitimate community organizing meetings, people gathering to discuss economic concerns, municipal budget issues, that kind of thing. But the meetings gradually became more focused on blame rather than solutions. Blame directed at whom? Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew. Government institutions initially. Federal agencies, state bureaucrats, county officials who seemed disconnected from the community's struggles. But the rhetoric expanded to include anyone who'd escaped Millbrook and achieved success elsewhere. Park consulted his files. In several intercepted conversations, participants expressed resentment toward local people who'd gotten above themselves and forgotten where they came from. Your name came up specifically in at least 3 separate discussions. The information felt like swallowing broken glass. Her family had been systematically manipulated to see her success as their betrayal, their legitimate economic grievances, weaponized by recruiters who understood exactly how to exploit family resentments. Santos added, "The recruiting appears to have been sophisticated. Someone with experience in group dynamics and psychological manipulation has been guiding the process. We're still trying to identify the primary organizer, but they've been careful to avoid electronic communications and maintain operational security." The mention of sophisticated recruiting sent a chill down Sarah's spine. Domestic terrorism groups had become increasingly proficient at targeting vulnerable communities, identifying the specific grievances and fears that could be weaponized into violence. Millbrook, with its combination of economic devastation and social fragmentation, would have been an ideal target for such efforts. "Any indication of outside funding or resources?" she asked. "Still investigating, but preliminary financial analysis suggests the group has been largely self-funded. Small contributions from members, mostly in cash to avoid banking records. The materials for explosive devices were purchased with cash from agricultural supply stores across 3 different counties." Morrison consulted his notes. "What concerns us is the level of planning and coordination. This isn't a spontaneous outburst of anger. Someone has been thinking strategically about maximum impact and minimum risk of early detection." Sarah walked to the window overlooking the high school parking lot, watching agents methodically prepare equipment and review tactical plans. Each person carried out their assigned responsibilities with professional competence, contributing to an operation designed to protect innocent lives and preserve public safety. They were good people doing important work, but she found herself wondering what they thought about investigating her family, whether they questioned her ability to remain objective, whether they saw her as an asset or a liability in the current situation. The psychological complexity of her position was unprecedented in her experience. She'd investigated countless cases involving family members of federal employees, children of judges who'd gotten involved with drug dealers, spouses of politicians who'd engaged in corruption, siblings of military officers who'd committed various crimes. But those cases had involved other people's families, other people's pain. This was different. This was personal in ways that her training hadn't prepared her to handle. Agent Rodriguez approached with an update from the surveillance teams. "Director, we've got movement at several target locations. The Chen family residence shows increased activity. Multiple vehicles arriving and departing, individuals carrying packages inside, curtains drawn on windows that are normally open during daylight hours." She handed Sarah a series of photographs taken with telephoto lenses. Body language analysis suggests they're preparing for something significant. The photographs showed her childhood home in a way she'd never seen it before, as a potential crime scene, a location where dangerous individuals were planning violence against innocent people. The house looked smaller than she remembered, shabbier, with peeling paint and an overgrown lawn that suggested her parents had given up on maintaining appearances. But it was still the place where she'd learned to read, where she'd practiced piano lessons, where she'd spent hours helping her mother with dinner, while asking questions about how the world worked. "What's the current assessment of public danger?" Sarah asked, forcing herself to focus on the operational requirements rather than the emotional implications. Morrison consulted with his team leaders before responding. "High and increasing." If they're planning to move tomorrow during the commissioners' meeting, they're looking at a target-rich environment with limited security. The courthouse wasn't designed with terrorism prevention in mind. Multiple entry points, minimal screening procedures, adjacent buildings that could provide cover or concealment for secondary attacks. Sarah felt the weight of command settling around her shoulders like a lead blanket. Every decision she made over the next 24 hours would have consequences that extended far beyond her family relationships. If she authorized arrests based on incomplete evidence and the suspects were ultimately innocent, she'd have destroyed lives and careers while confirming every suspicion her community had ever harbored about federal overreach. If she waited for more definitive proof and an attack occurred, the blood of innocent victims would be on her hands. "I want to try direct contact," she said, the words emerging before she'd fully considered their implications. "Before we move to arrests, I want to attempt communication with the subjects." The suggestion generated immediate concern among her senior staff. Santos spoke first. "Director, personal contact with subjects in an active domestic terrorism investigation poses significant risks. They know your identity, your position, your authority. Contact could accelerate their timeline, trigger premature action, or compromise operational security." Park nodded agreement. "Standard protocol is to maintain surveillance until we have sufficient evidence for arrests or until imminent danger requires immediate intervention. Personal involvement by the director, especially given family connections, could complicate both prosecution and public perception of the investigation." Their concerns were valid and professionally appropriate, but Sarah felt the pull of something deeper than protocol. These weren't just subjects in a domestic terrorism investigation. They were people she'd shared Christmas dinners with, people who'd taught her to drive, people who had once been proud of her achievements, even if that pride had curdled into resentment. Maybe, if she could reach the parts of them that remembered who she'd been before she became who she was, she could find a way to resolve the situation without violence or arrests. "I understand the risks," she said, her voice carrying the authority that had earned her the directorship. "But I also understand these people in ways that might be operationally valuable. They're not career criminals or sophisticated terrorists. They're hurt, angry people who've been manipulated by someone who understands their vulnerabilities. If there's a chance to de-escalate through communication, I want to take it." Morrison studied her carefully, weighing the operational risks against the potential benefits of her personal connection to the subjects. "What did you have in mind?" "Phone contact first. Arrange a call to my parents' house. Identify myself as someone with authority to address their concerns. Try to understand what they really want beyond violence." Sarah felt the plan forming as she spoke. "If they're willing to talk, we might be able to negotiate a peaceful resolution. If they're not, we'll have additional intelligence about their state of mind and commitment level." The proposal was unconventional, but not unreasonable. Negotiation with domestic terrorism subjects had become standard practice when circumstances permitted. And Sarah's personal relationship with the subjects might provide leverage that wouldn't be available to outside negotiators. But everyone in the room understood that the stakes extended far beyond operational success or failure. They were asking their director to potentially sacrifice her family relationships in service of her professional responsibilities. The phone call was scheduled for 3:47 p.m., timed to catch the Chen family during what surveillance had identified as their typical afternoon routine. Sarah sat in the communications center of the command post, surrounded by recording equipment and monitoring devices, while her senior staff positioned themselves to analyze every word, every pause, every emotional inflection that might reveal the true scope of the threat they were facing. Her father answered on the fourth ring, his voice carrying the cautious suspicion that had become his default response to unexpected calls. "Yeah? Dad, it's Sarah." The silence that followed lasted nearly 15 seconds. Long enough for the technical staff to verify voice recognition and begin emotional stress analysis, long enough for Sarah to question every decision that had brought her to this moment of trying to save her family from themselves. "Sarah?" Her father's voice carried surprise, wariness, and something that might have been relief or might have been dread. "Didn't expect to hear from you." Thought you were too important now for regular phone calls. I'm calling because I'm worried about you, Dad. About all of you. Sarah forced her voice to remain calm, professional but personal. I've heard some concerning things about activities in Millbrook, and I wanted to reach out before situations escalate beyond what anyone intends. Another pause, this one filled with the sound of her father breathing heavily, perhaps consulting with others in the room. What kind of activities? Who's been talking to you about our business? The kind of activities that bring federal attention, Dad, the kind that could hurt innocent people and destroy families. Sarah glanced at Morrison, who was monitoring the conversation while coordinating with surveillance teams. I know you're angry. I know you feel like the system has failed you. But violence isn't going to solve anything. It's only going to make everything worse. Violence? Her father's voice rose with indignation that sounded genuine. Who said anything about violence? We're just citizens, exercising our constitutional rights, meeting with our neighbors, discussing our concerns about how this country is being run into the ground by people who don't give a damn about working families. The response was carefully worded, almost coached, suggesting that someone had prepared the group for potential law enforcement contact. But underneath the prepared language, Sarah could hear the authentic anger and hurt that had made her family vulnerable to manipulation in the first place. Dad, I know about the meetings at the community center, I know about the materials that have been acquired, I know about the plans for tomorrow. Sarah took a breath, preparing to cross a line she couldn't uncross. I'm calling you as your daughter, but I'm also calling you as the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I'm offering you a chance to step back from something that's going to end badly for everyone involved. The silence that followed was different, deeper, more frightened, charged with the recognition that their activities had attracted attention at the highest levels of federal law enforcement. Sarah could hear muffled conversation in the background, voices she recognized discussing responses she couldn't quite make out. You're threatening us. When her father's voice returned, it carried a new quality. Not just anger anymore, but betrayal and something approaching desperation. Our own daughter is threatening us on behalf of the government that's been destroying our community for 20 years. I'm not threatening you, Dad. I'm trying to save you. Sarah felt tears threatening and forced them back, knowing that emotion might be perceived as weakness by people who'd already convinced themselves that she was the enemy. Whatever you think you're fighting against, whatever you think you're trying to prove, there are legal ways to address your concerns. Ways that don't involve hurting people, that don't destroy your lives and the lives of everyone around you. Legal ways? Her mother's voice joined the conversation, sharp with decades of accumulated resentment. Like the legal way they foreclosed on the Kowalskis after Tom worked at that plant for 30 years? Like the legal way they shut down the mill and left this whole town to rot? Like the legal way they raise our taxes while cutting services and telling us we should be grateful for whatever scraps they throw our way? The pain in her mother's voice was raw and real, representing years of watching their community disintegrate while feeling powerless to stop the decline. Sarah recognized the legitimate grievances underlying the dangerous rhetoric, understanding how economic desperation and social isolation could be weaponized by people who offered simple solutions to complex problems. Mom, I understand why you're angry. The system has failed Millbrook in a lot of ways. But targeting innocent people who are just trying to participate in local government isn't going to fix anything. It's going to make you into the very thing you think you're fighting against. Innocent people? Danny's voice joined the conversation, carrying a bitterness that made Sarah's heart ache. Like the county commissioners who voted to raise taxes while exempting their friends, businesses, like the judges who rubber stamp every foreclosure that comes across their desks. Like the federal agents who show up in our town treating us like criminals for having opinions? The conversation was revealing layers of grievance and resentment that went far beyond what intelligence reports had suggested. Her family wasn't just angry about economic conditions. They felt systematically betrayed by institutions they'd once trusted, abandoned by representatives they'd once supported, judged by standards they'd never had a chance to meet. Danny, I know you've had a hard time. I know you're struggling, and I know you feel like no one cares about what happens to people like us. Sarah tried to inject warmth into her voice, to reach the brother who'd once looked up to her despite their differences. But I care. I've always cared. And I'm telling you that whatever you think you're planning for tomorrow is going to hurt everyone you love. Everyone I love? Danny's laugh was harsh and hollow. You mean like how you loved us when you left town the day after graduation and never looked back? Like how you loved us when you got too important to come home for Christmas? Like how you love us now by calling to threaten us with federal charges? The accusation cut deep because it contained elements of truth wrapped in misconceptions and hurt feelings. Sarah had left Millbrook, had built a life separate from her family's expectations, had become someone they couldn't recognize or relate to, but she'd never stopped loving them, even when that love had become complicated by their inability to understand her choices or support her achievements. "I never stopped loving you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I couldn't stay in Millbrook and become the person I needed to be. I couldn't accept that my dreams were too big or my questions were too dangerous. I had to leave to find out who I really was. And who you really are is someone who calls her family to threaten them with arrest?" Her father's voice had gotten quieter, more controlled, which surveillance analysis would later identify as a sign of increasing danger rather than de-escalation. Someone who works for the same government that's been destroying everything we care about? Sarah realized that her attempt at personal connection was backfiring, that her family had moved beyond the point where emotional appeals could overcome ideological commitment. They'd constructed a worldview in which her success represented their failure, her achievements represented their abandonment, her career represented everything that was wrong with the systems they'd come to hate. "Dad, I work for the American people. I work to protect communities like Millbrook from people who want to exploit their anger and desperation. I took an oath to defend the Constitution and serve justice, and that's what I'm trying to do right now." Sarah felt herself shifting into director mode, recognizing that negotiation might be more effective than pleading. "But I'm also your daughter, and I don't want to see you destroy your lives over grievances that could be addressed through legal channels." "Legal channels that haven't worked for 20 years? Her mother's voice carried exhaustion along with anger. "Sarah, honey, you've been gone so long you don't understand what it's like here anymore. People are desperate. Families are falling apart. The young people leave as soon as they can, and the ones who stay behind feel forgotten by everyone, including their own government." The observation was accurate and devastating. Sarah had left, had built her career in cities where opportunity existed and institutions functioned, where hard work and talent could translate into advancement and recognition. She'd lost touch with the daily reality of places like Millbrook, where those same qualities often led to frustration and resentment when systems failed to reward effort or acknowledge worth. "Then help me understand," Sarah said, making one more attempt to find common ground. "Tell me what you really want. Tell me what would make things better. But tell me without planning violence, without threatening innocent people, without making choices that can't be undone." The silence stretched longer this time, filled with background conversation she couldn't quite decipher. Sarah could imagine her family consulting with other members of their group, weighing the risks and benefits of continued communication with a federal law enforcement official who happened to be their estranged daughter. When her father's voice returned, it carried a finality that made Sarah's chest tighten with recognition. "What we want is for people like you to remember where you came from. What we want is for the government to serve working families instead of elites who think they know better than everyone else. What we want is respect for the people who built this country and are watching it get torn down by bureaucrats and politicians who never worked an honest day in their lives." "And you think violence is going to earn you that respect?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. "We think violence is the only language people like you understand anymore," Danny said, his voice carrying a cold certainty that chilled Sarah to her core. "We tried voting, we tried petitions, we tried following all your legal channels. Nothing changed except things got worse. So tomorrow, we're going to send a message that can't be ignored, or explained away, or buried in some government report that nobody reads." The admission was clear enough to constitute evidence of criminal conspiracy, recorded and witnessed by multiple federal agents who could testify to its contents in court. Sarah's family had just confessed to planning a terrorist attack, and her attempt at negotiation had accomplished nothing except gathering evidence that would be used to prosecute them. "Dad, Mom, Danny, please listen to me one more time." Sarah felt the weight of her badge, the responsibility of her office, the love she still felt for people who'd chosen to see her as their enemy. "If you go through with whatever you're planning tomorrow, People are going to get hurt. Innocent people who have families, who have children, who are just trying to participate in their community. And you're going to spend the rest of your lives in federal prison, knowing that you became the very thing you thought you were fighting against. We're already in prison, her mother said softly. We've been in prison for 20 years, watching everything we care about disappear while people like you tell us we should be grateful for the scraps. At least tomorrow we'll finally do something that matters. The call ended with a soft click, leaving Sarah staring at the phone while her senior staff processed what they'd just heard. The conversation had provided valuable intelligence about the group's mindset and commitment level, but it had also confirmed their worst fears about the likelihood of peaceful resolution. Morrison spoke first. Director, we have probable cause for immediate arrests. The statements made during this call constitute clear evidence of conspiracy to commit domestic terrorism. We can move within the hour. Sarah nodded, understanding that her role as FBI Director now superseded her relationship as daughter and sister. Coordinate with tactical teams. I want arrests conducted simultaneously to prevent any subjects from fleeing or accelerating their timeline. She paused, feeling something break inside her chest. And I want maximum protection for everyone involved, including the subjects. Despite everything, they're still my family. Agent Santos approached with tactical plans and arrest warrants that had been prepared during the phone call. Director, there's one more thing you should know. During the background conversation while you were speaking with your father, our audio enhancement picked up someone coaching responses and directing strategy. Someone who wasn't family, someone with experience in operational security and crisis management. The revelation added another layer of complexity to an already devastating situation. Sarah's family hadn't just stumbled into domestic terrorism. They'd been recruited and manipulated by someone with expertise in exploiting vulnerable communities. The recognition didn't excuse their choices, but it helped explain how people she'd once known had become people she could barely recognize. Any identification of the outside voice? She asked. Still working on it, but preliminary analysis suggests military or law enforcement background. Someone familiar with federal procedures and investigative techniques. Santos consulted her notes. Which explains why they've been so careful about electronic communications and operational security. Sarah felt the final pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. Her family had become pawns in someone else's larger strategy, their legitimate grievances weaponized by an individual who understood exactly how to transform anger into violence. While they remained responsible for their final choices, they had been deliberately targeted and psychologically manipulated by experienced recruiters who exploited their economic desperation and family resentments. Timeline for arrest, she asked, though she knew the answer would determine whether she ever spoke to her family again as free people. Sunset, approximately 7:30 p.m. Tactical teams are in position. Warrants have been signed. Backup units are standing by in case subjects attempt to flee or resist arrest. Morrison consulted with his team leaders. All subjects will be taken into custody simultaneously to prevent coordination of resistance or destruction of evidence. Sarah walked to the window overlooking the high school parking lot, watching the sun begin its descent toward the horizon that had once defined the limits of her world. In a few hours, federal agents would arrest her parents, her brother, and multiple other members of her community on charges that could result in life imprisonment. She would have protected innocent lives and upheld her oath of office, but she would also have lost her family forever. The weight of command had never felt heavier, the burden of leadership never more personal. She'd spent her entire career preparing for moments when difficult decisions would determine life and death outcomes for strangers. She'd never imagined facing such a moment when the lives at stake belonged to the people who'd raised her, whose DNA she shared, whose pain she understood even when she couldn't accept their solutions. If you're finding this story gripping and want to see how it ends, please take a moment to like this video and share it with others who appreciate complex storytelling. Sarah watched from the command post as tactical teams moved with practiced efficiency through neighborhoods she'd once known as intimately as her own heartbeat. Each radio transmission brought updates that felt like physical blows. Suspect 1 in custody. Suspect 2 secured without resistance. evidence team en route to search warrant locations. Her parents had been arrested in their living room, where they'd been watching the evening news with the volume turned up too loud, the way elderly couples did when they wanted to avoid talking to each other. Danny had been taken into custody at the automotive shop where he'd been working part-time, his hands still covered with grease from the engine he'd been rebuilding. None of them had resisted arrest, according to the tactical team reports. They'd seemed almost relieved, as if the waiting had become more exhausting than the inevitable consequences. The search of her childhood home had yielded a devastating inventory: detailed floor plans of the county courthouse, photographs of security cameras and entrance points, a timeline for the next day's commissioners, meeting, and enough explosive materials to level half a city block. Hidden beneath her old bed, the same bed where she'd read books by flashlight after her parents had told her to go to sleep, agents had discovered a manifesto outlining the group's grievances and their belief that violence was the only remaining method of communication with a government that had stopped listening to real Americans. But the most significant discovery had come from the basement, where her father had maintained a workshop since her childhood. Buried beneath years of accumulated tools and seasonal decorations, agents had found communications equipment, encrypted hard drives, and evidence of coordination with similar groups across 3 states. The domestic terrorism cell in Millbrook hadn't been an isolated outbreak of local anger. It had been part of a larger network, carefully organized and strategically directed by individuals with extensive experience in military tactics and psychological operations. The revelation had transformed the investigation from a local domestic terrorism case into a multi-jurisdictional conspiracy involving dozens of suspects and potential targets across the Midwest. Sarah's family had been recruited not just as participants but as symbols, their participation designed to demonstrate that the movement could attract quote, regular Americans who weren't typically associated with extremist activities. Their involvement had been both genuine and manipulated, their anger both authentic and exploited. Special Agent Morrison approached with preliminary interrogation reports, his expression carrying the weight of someone who understood the personal dimensions of the intelligence he was delivering. "Director, we've identified the primary recruiter. Former Army Special Forces, discharged in 2019 for conduct issues, has been moving through economically distressed communities, identifying potential assets." He paused, consulting his notes with careful precision. "He specifically targeted your family after researching your background and position. Their recruitment was designed to send a message about the movement's reach and sophistication." The information felt like swallowing acid. Her family's involvement hadn't been accidental or organic. They'd been selected specifically because of their connection to her. Their participation intended to demonstrate that even the FBI director's family could be turned against the institutions she'd dedicated her life to serving. Their genuine grievances had been weaponized not just against local officials but against Sarah personally, transforming their anger into a tool designed to damage her credibility and effectiveness. "Has anyone claimed responsibility for the broader network?" she asked, though she suspected the answer would reveal connections that extended far beyond Millbrook's boundaries. Communications intercepts suggest coordination with groups in Ohio, Indiana, and Michigan. Similar recruitment patterns, similar target selection, similar materials and techniques. Morrison handed her additional files. "The good news is that we've disrupted a significant domestic terrorism network. The bad news is that your family's arrests are going to generate media attention that could inspire copycat activities or accelerate timelines for other cells." Sarah understood the implications immediately. Her family's story would become national news within hours. FBI Director arrests own parents in domestic terrorism investigation. The headlines would focus on the personal drama, rather than the larger threat, the human interest angle, rather than the systemic issues that had made communities like Millbrook vulnerable to extremist recruitment. She would become a symbol either of dedication to duty over family loyalty or of government overreach against ordinary Americans, depending on the political perspective of whoever was telling the story. "Media strategy?" she asked, knowing that her response to the inevitable questions would shape public perception of both the investigation and her leadership. Assistant Director Park approached with preliminary talking points prepared by the Bureau's Public Affairs Office. We're recommending a brief statement emphasizing the professional nature of the investigation, the importance of following evidence regardless of personal connections, and the Bureau's commitment to protecting all Americans from domestic terrorism threats. He handed her a draft press release. No personal details, no discussion of family dynamics, focused strictly on the law enforcement aspects. The strategy was professionally appropriate, but personally devastating. Sarah would be required to discuss her family's arrest in clinical terms, to treat the people who'd raised her as subjects in a criminal investigation, rather than human beings whose pain she understood even when she couldn't accept their choices. She would have to transform the most personal crisis of her life into talking points designed to minimize political damage and maintain institutional credibility. Agent Santos joined the group with updates from the ongoing interrogations. Director, we're getting cooperation from several subjects, including some who were unaware of the full scope of the planned operation. Your parents appear to have been recruited for symbolic value rather than operational expertise. She consulted her tablet. Your brother Danny provided detailed information about the recruitment process and the outside influences that shaped the group's activities. The news brought mixed emotions. Sarah felt relief that her family members were cooperating with the investigation, providing information that might prevent other attacks and protect other communities. But she also felt heartbroken that their cooperation was motivated by recognition that they'd been manipulated by people who'd never cared about their actual welfare or concerns. Are they asking to speak with me? She asked, though she wasn't sure whether she hoped the answer would be yes or no. Santos shook her head. They've specifically requested that you not be involved in their interrogations or plea negotiations. They seem to understand that your position creates conflicts of interest that could complicate both their legal situation and your professional responsibilities. The rejection felt like a final severing of already damaged relationships. Her family had chosen to spare her the additional pain of having to interrogate them personally, but their consideration felt like a recognition that she was no longer someone they could trust with their vulnerabilities. She had become, in their eyes, a representative of the system rather than a member of their family. The evening stretched into night as the investigation expanded to include the broader network of co-conspirators and potential targets. Sarah remained in the command post, coordinating with field offices across multiple states, reviewing evidence that revealed the sophisticated nature of the recruitment and planning process, authorizing resources for follow-up investigations that would prevent similar attacks in other vulnerable communities. But between the operational requirements and administrative responsibilities, she found herself thinking about the larger questions raised by her family's involvement in domestic terrorism. How had people she'd grown up with become so alienated from American institutions that violence seemed like a reasonable response to their grievances? How had their legitimate concerns about economic inequality and social neglect been transformed into hatred for the very systems designed to address such problems? The answers weren't simple or comfortable. Millbrook had been economically devastated by forces beyond local control: globalization, technological change, policy decisions made by people who'd never experienced the consequences of their choices. The community had felt abandoned by institutions that claimed to serve everyone but seemed to benefit only some. That abandonment had created vulnerabilities that extremist recruiters had exploited with professional precision. But Sarah also recognized that her family's choices couldn't be excused by their circumstances. Other families in Millbrook were experiencing the same economic pressures and social isolation without turning to violence. Other communities facing similar challenges were finding constructive rather than destructive responses to their problems. Her family had made conscious decisions to embrace hatred rather than hope, destruction rather than construction. 3 days after the arrests, Sarah received a letter from her mother, delivered through the Federal Public Defender's Office with appropriate security screening. The handwriting was familiar, the same careful cursive that had labeled her school lunch bags and signed permission slips for field trips. But the content revealed a woman Sarah barely recognized. "Sarah," the letter began, "I know you probably don't want to hear from me, and I understand why. What we did was wrong. And I'm not writing to ask for forgiveness or understanding. I'm writing because I want you to know that we never hated you, even when it seemed like we did. We were angry and hurt and scared. and we let other people turn those feelings into something ugly. The letter continued for 3 pages, outlining her mother's growing recognition that the group had been manipulated by people who'd understood exactly how to exploit their vulnerabilities. She described months of meetings where legitimate concerns about economic conditions had gradually been transformed into conspiracy theories about government overreach and elite manipulation. She explained how their resentment towards Sarah had been encouraged and amplified by recruiters who'd seen their family dynamics as useful tools for psychological manipulation. "We were proud of you," her mother wrote near the end. "We were always proud of you, even when we couldn't show it properly. But that pride got mixed up with our own feelings of failure and disappointment, and we let other people convince us that your success somehow meant our worthlessness. We know now that wasn't true, but the knowing came too late to stop us from making choices we can't take back." The letter ended with a request that Sarah not visit them in prison, not sacrifice her career or reputation by maintaining public connections to convicted domestic terrorists. "You have important work to do," her mother had written, "work that protects other families from making the mistakes we made. Don't let our failures stop you from serving the country the way you've always wanted to serve it." Sarah read the letter 3 times before placing it in her personal files, understanding that it represented both an ending and a beginning. Her family relationships as she'd known them were finished, casualties of choices that couldn't be undone, and consequences that couldn't be avoided. But her work as FBI director had been transformed by the experience, deepened by personal understanding of how domestic terrorism recruitment operated, and strengthened by recognition of the communities and individuals most vulnerable to extremist manipulation. Over the following months, Sarah used the lessons learned from her family's case to reshape the Bureau's approach to domestic terrorism prevention. She authorized new community outreach programs designed to identify and address the economic and social conditions that made individuals susceptible to extremist recruitment. She expanded funding for mental health resources and economic development initiatives in communities similar to Millbrook. She worked with social media companies to identify and counter the sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques used by domestic terrorism recruiters. The initiatives weren't popular with everyone. Some critics accused her of being soft on terrorism, of prioritizing prevention over punishment. Others suggested that her personal experience had compromised her objectivity, that her family connections had influenced her professional judgment. But Sarah understood that effective counterterrorism required addressing root causes as well as immediate threats, that protecting American communities meant understanding what made them vulnerable to exploitation in the first place. 1 year after the arrests, Sarah returned to Millbrook for the first time since the investigation. She came not as FBI director but as a private citizen, driving her personal vehicle through streets that looked exactly the same but felt completely different. The community center where her family had been recruited was now home to a job training program funded by federal grants she'd helped authorize. The courthouse that had been targeted was surrounded by new small businesses that had opened as part of an economic development initiative designed to revitalize rural communities. The changes were modest but meaningful, representing hope rather than despair, construction rather than destruction. Millbrook would never be what it had been during the steel mill years, but it might become something different and better if given sufficient support and resources. Sarah felt cautiously optimistic that other communities facing similar challenges might find constructive paths forward if institutions responded to their legitimate concerns, before extremist recruiters exploited their vulnerabilities. She didn't visit her family's house, didn't stop by the graves of relatives who died while she'd been building her career in distant cities. Those connections belonged to a version of herself that no longer existed, replaced by someone who understood the weight of leadership and the price of difficult choices. But she drove slowly through the neighborhoods of her childhood, remembering the girl who'd asked too many questions and dreamed too big, grateful that someone had encouraged those dreams instead of crushing them. 3 years later, the Senate Judiciary Committee hearing room fell silent as Senator Patricia Hawkins leaned forward, her expression carrying the weight of someone prepared to ask questions that would define a career. Sarah sat at the witness table, her FBI director's badge catching the harsh fluorescent lighting, surrounded by documents that represented 3 years of unprecedented success in domestic terrorism prevention. But she knew the next question would have nothing to do with statistics or policy achievements. Director Chen, Senator Hawkins began, her voice carrying the particular tone reserved for political theater. 3 years ago, you made the decision to authorize federal arrests of your own family members on domestic terrorism charges. Some have praised this as dedication to duty over personal loyalty. Others have suggested it represents the kind of government overreach that creates the very resentment your policies claim to address. How do you respond to critics who suggest that your family situation has compromised your objectivity in domestic terrorism matters? Sarah had anticipated this question for months, had prepared responses that balanced personal reflection with professional responsibility. But sitting in the same chamber where she'd first been confirmed as director, facing senators who would determine whether she deserved reappointment to a second term, the weight of that decision felt as heavy as it had 3 years ago. Senator, the decision to authorize those arrests was the most difficult of my career, but it was also the clearest. Sarah's voice carried steady conviction. My oath of office requires me to protect all Americans from threats both foreign and domestic, regardless of my personal relationships with the individuals involved. My family members made choices that put innocent lives at risk, and my responsibility as FBI Director was to prevent that harm from occurring. But doesn't your personal experience create conflicts of interest in how you approach domestic terrorism policy more broadly? Senator Hawkins pressed. Your initiatives have focused heavily on community outreach and prevention rather than traditional law enforcement responses. Critics suggest you're trying to fix your family dysfunction on the taxpayer's dime. The accusations stung because it contained a grain of truth wrapped in political calculation. Sarah's approach to domestic terrorism had been shaped by her understanding of how ordinary grievances could be weaponized by sophisticated recruiters. Her policies emphasized addressing root causes, because she'd seen firsthand how economic desperation and social isolation could make even good people vulnerable to extremist manipulation. Senator, my personal experience provided insight that has made me more effective at this job, not less. Sarah straightened in her chair, drawing on reserves of confidence built through years of difficult decisions and positive outcomes. In the 3 years since those arrests, domestic terrorism incidents have decreased by 37%. Community tip reports have increased by 215%. We've disrupted 43 planned attacks and identified over 300 individuals who were in various stages of radicalization. The statistics represented lives saved and communities protected, but they also represented a fundamental shift in how federal law enforcement approached domestic terrorism. Instead of waiting for threats to mature into violence, the Bureau now worked proactively to identify and address the conditions that made individuals susceptible to extremist recruitment. The strategy had been controversial, but undeniably effective. Senator Robert Martinez, a longtime supporter of Sarah's nomination, smiled as he prepared his follow-up question. Director Chen, can you elaborate on how your family situation has actually enhanced your understanding of domestic terrorism threats? What insights did that experience provide that might not have been available to someone without personal connections to radicalization processes? Sarah felt grateful for the opportunity to reframe the conversation around professional competence rather than personal drama. Senator, the investigation revealed that domestic terrorism recruitment has become increasingly sophisticated, targeting specific vulnerabilities in ways that traditional law enforcement approaches weren't designed to counter. My family members weren't career criminals or ideological extremists. They were ordinary people experiencing economic hardship and social isolation who were systematically manipulated by individuals with expertise in psychological operations. She consulted her prepared notes, though she could have delivered the analysis from memory. Understanding that recruitment process allowed us to develop prevention strategies that address vulnerabilities before they can be exploited. We now work with community organizations, mental health professionals, and economic development agencies to identify individuals and communities at risk, providing support and resources that make extremist recruitment less appealing and less successful. The hearing continued for another 2 hours, with senators from both parties asking pointed questions about budget allocations, civil liberties concerns, and the balance between prevention and prosecution in domestic terrorism cases. Sarah answered each query with careful precision, drawing on 3 years of experience that had transformed her from a highly competent law enforcement official into a national leader who understood the complex social dynamics underlying America's domestic security challenges. 6 months later, the reappointment confirmation had passed by a comfortable margin, but Sarah felt no particular satisfaction in the victory. Political success had always been less important to her than operational effectiveness, and the metrics that mattered most couldn't be measured in Senate votes. The communities that hadn't experienced terrorist attacks, the families that hadn't been torn apart by radicalization, the individuals who'd found constructive rather than destructive responses to their legitimate grievances, those were the measures that defined her success as FBI director. She stood in her office overlooking Pennsylvania Avenue, watching the steady flow of citizens going about their daily lives with the kind of casual security that effective law enforcement made possible. Most of them would never know how many threats had been identified and neutralized before reaching public awareness, how many communities had been protected through proactive intervention rather than reactive investigation. Agent Rodriguez approached with the morning briefing, her expression carrying the particular satisfaction that came from reporting positive developments rather than emerging crises. Director, we've got updates from the Millbrook Community Development Initiative. Unemployment is down 18% from 3 years ago, small business formation is up 43%, and social services report significant decreases in domestic violence and substance abuse cases. The news brought Sarah genuine pleasure, representing hope for a community that had felt forgotten by the institutions designed to serve it. Millbrook would never be what it had been during its industrial heyday, but it was becoming something different and potentially better, a place where people could build futures rather than nursing grievances, where economic opportunity existed alongside social cohesion. Any updates on the Chen family members? Sarah asked, though she maintained only professional interest in their situations. Your parents were both granted early release 6 months ago for cooperation and good behavior. They're living in a supervised community residence in Ohio, participating in a federal reintegration program that helps former extremists transition back to civilian life. Rodriguez consulted her tablet. Your brother Danny completed his sentence last month and has been accepted into a job training program for automotive technology. According to his caseworker, he's been clean and sober for 18 months and has expressed interest in volunteering with organizations that work on de-radicalization. Sarah nodded, feeling neither satisfaction nor disappointment at the news. Her family members had made choices that had consequences, had accepted responsibility for their actions, and were apparently making efforts to rebuild their lives in constructive ways. She wished them well, but their paths and hers would likely never cross again. They belonged to chapters of her life that had been closed by choices that couldn't be undone. 2 years later, the graduation ceremony at the FBI National Academy buzzed with the controlled excitement of new agents preparing to begin careers that would define their adult lives. Sarah stood at the podium, looking out at faces that reminded her of her own younger self, eager, determined, committed to ideals of justice and service that would be tested in ways they couldn't yet imagine. 5 years ago, she began, I faced the most difficult decision of my career. I was forced to choose between my family relationships and my professional responsibilities, between personal loyalty and public duty. The choice was painful but clear, because the oath we take as law enforcement officers isn't just about enforcing laws. It's about protecting communities, preventing harm, and serving justice regardless of the personal cost. The audience listened with the focused attention that came from understanding that her words carried the weight of lived experience rather than theoretical instruction. These new agents would face their own difficult choices, their own moments when personal feelings conflicted with professional obligations, their own tests of character and commitment. But I want you to understand that the most important lesson from that experience wasn't about choosing duty over family, Sarah continued. It was about understanding that effective law enforcement requires us to address root causes, as well as immediate symptoms, to work proactively rather than just reactively, to build communities rather than just investigating crimes after they occur. She gestured toward charts displaying the Bureau's domestic terrorism prevention statistics, numbers that represented a fundamental shift in how federal law enforcement approached its mission. In the past 5 years, we've prevented more attacks through community engagement and early intervention than we ever stopped through traditional investigative methods. We've learned that the best way to protect American communities is to understand what makes them vulnerable and address those vulnerabilities before they can be exploited. The graduation ceremony concluded with the traditional oath-taking, new agents raising their right hands to swear dedication to the Constitution and the rule of law. Sarah watched their faces during the ceremony, seeing reflections of her own younger self when she'd first committed to a career in federal law enforcement. They would face challenges she couldn't anticipate, make decisions that would test their character in ways that no training could fully prepare them for. 10 years after the arrests, the letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered through official channels with appropriate security screening. Sarah recognized the handwriting immediately, though it looked older, more careful, carrying the weight of someone who'd learned to choose words with greater precision. The return address showed a small town in Ohio that she'd never visited, where her parents had apparently built whatever remained of their lives. "Dear Sarah," the letter began, "I know you probably don't want to hear from us, and I understand if you choose not to respond to this letter. But your mother wanted me to write because she saw you on the news talking about the 10th anniversary of domestic terrorism prevention programs. And she wanted you to know how proud we are of the work you've been doing." The letter continued for 2 pages, describing her parents, life in their Ohio community, their work with organizations that helped former extremists reintegrate into society, their growing understanding of how they'd been manipulated by people who'd never cared about their actual welfare. Her father wrote about volunteering at a community center that provided job training and mental health services to economically displaced workers. Her mother had become involved with a support group for families affected by extremist recruitment. "We understand now what we couldn't see then," her father had written. "Those people who recruited us didn't care about our problems or our community. They just wanted to use our anger for their own purposes, and we let them, because it felt better to blame someone else for our pain than to do the hard work of finding real solutions." The letter included updates on Danny, who had completed his automotive technology program and was now working for a company that specialized in converting traditional vehicles to electric power. He'd married a woman he'd met in his recovery program, and they were expecting their first child, a daughter they planned to name Patricia, after the guidance counselor who'd encouraged Sarah's academic ambitions decades earlier. "We know we can't undo the choices we made," the letter concluded, "and we're not asking for forgiveness or reconciliation, but we wanted you to know that your work matters, that the programs you've created are helping people like us find better ways to deal with their problems. Maybe someday you'll visit Ohio, and we can show you the community center where your mother volunteers. You'd be proud of the work they're doing here." Sarah read the letter 3 times before filing it with the other personal documents she maintained separate from her professional responsibilities. She felt neither forgiveness nor resentment toward her family members, but rather a kind of peaceful acceptance that their choices had led them toward different paths that might occasionally intersect but would never truly reconnect. 15 years later, the retirement ceremony took place in the same FBI headquarters auditorium where Sarah had been sworn in as director 16 years earlier. She stood at the podium one final time, looking out at an audience that included agents she'd recruited, policies she'd implemented, and programs that would continue long after her departure. The Domestic Terrorism Prevention Initiative had become standard practice across federal law enforcement, credited with preventing hundreds of attacks and protecting thousands of lives. "When I began this job," Sarah said, her voice carrying the authority earned through decades of difficult decisions and positive outcomes, "I thought leadership meant making tough choices and accepting the consequences. I've learned that real leadership means understanding the human cost of every decision, working to address root causes rather than just symptoms, and building systems that protect everyone, including people who might not understand why they need protection." The audience included representatives from communities that had benefited from her prevention programs, families whose members had been steered away from extremist recruitment, local officials who'd learned to identify and address the conditions that made their constituents vulnerable to manipulation. Their presence represented the real measure of her success as a leader. Attorney General Jennifer Walsh stepped forward to present Sarah with the Attorney General's Distinguished Service Award, the highest honor available to federal law enforcement officials. Director Chen has transformed how America approaches domestic security, she announced. Her leadership has made us safer, not just through law enforcement but through prevention. Not just by punishing crimes but by addressing the conditions that create criminals. The ceremony concluded with Sarah's final address to the Bureau employees who'd served under her leadership. She spoke about the importance of understanding that law enforcement was ultimately about serving communities, protecting the vulnerable, and building a society where everyone had opportunities to contribute constructively rather than destructively. 20 years after Sarah stood in the Millbrook Community Center, surrounded by photographs and displays that told the story of a town's transformation from economic devastation to cautious prosperity, the center occupied the same building where her family had been recruited by domestic terrorists 2 decades earlier, but it now served as a hub for job training, mental health services, and community organizing focused on constructive, rather than destructive change. The invitation to speak at the center's 20th anniversary celebration had come as a surprise, delivered by the current mayor, a young woman who'd grown up in Millbrook but returned after college with plans to build rather than escape. Sarah had accepted the invitation not as former FBI director but as someone who'd grown up in the community and understood both its challenges and its potential. 20 years ago, she told the assembled crowd, this building was a place where people gathered to nurse grievances and plan violence. Today, it's a place where people gather to solve problems and build futures. The difference isn't just in the programs or the funding, it's in the choice between hope and despair, between construction and destruction. The audience included many people she recognized from her childhood, though they looked older and, in many cases, more hopeful than when she'd last seen them. The community had never fully recovered its industrial prosperity, but it had found other forms of economic activity: small manufacturing, agricultural processing, renewable energy projects that provided decent employment without the environmental costs of the old steel mill. After her speech, Sarah walked through the neighborhood where she'd grown up, noting the changes that 2 decades of investment and attention had brought. The houses were better maintained, the streets cleaner, the atmosphere less heavy with the despair that had made the community vulnerable to extremist recruitment. Children played in yards that had once been empty, their laughter carrying the sound of possibility rather than resignation. She didn't visit her childhood home, which had been sold after her parents' arrest and converted into a duplex that housed 2 young families. But she stood across the street for a moment, remembering the girl who'd asked too many questions and dreamed too big, grateful that someone had encouraged those dreams instead of teaching her to accept limitations as permanent conditions. The local newspaper had requested an interview, and Sarah found herself sitting in the same diner where she'd once studied for high school exams, while trying to block out her family's arguments about money and opportunities and the unfairness of life in general. The reporter was a young man who'd moved to Millbrook specifically to cover rural economic development, drawn by stories of communities that had found ways to thrive, despite experiencing the kind of industrial decline that had devastated so many similar places. "What do you think changed?" he asked, his recorder capturing her words while his photographer documented her return to a place she'd left so many years ago. What made the difference between the Millbrook that produced domestic terrorists and the Millbrook that's become a model for rural revitalization? Sarah considered the question carefully, understanding that her answer would be quoted in articles and referenced in academic studies about domestic terrorism prevention and community development. "Investment," she said finally. "Not just financial investment, though that was important, but investment of attention, of respect, of recognition, that people in places like Millbrook have legitimate concerns that deserve serious responses." She gestured toward the window, where she could see the community center and the small businesses that had opened around it. When people feel heard and valued, when they have realistic opportunities to improve their circumstances, when institutions actually serve their needs instead of just claiming to serve them, that's when communities become resistant to extremist recruitment. Hope is the best antidote to hate. 25 years later, the phone call came on a quiet Thursday afternoon, while Sarah was working in the garden of the small house she'd purchased in rural Virginia after her retirement from federal service. The caller identified herself as Patricia Chen, Danny's daughter, now 24 years old, and calling to invite her aunt to her wedding. "I know this might be awkward," Patricia said, her voice carrying nervous energy that reminded Sarah of her own younger self. My parents told me about the family history, about what happened before I was born. But they also told me about you, about your work, about how you've spent your life protecting people and communities. I'd really like you to be part of my wedding if you're willing. The invitation was unexpected but not unwelcome. Sarah had followed her brother's life from a distance, noting his successful completion of addiction recovery programs, his stable employment in the renewable energy sector, his marriage to a woman who'd also overcome extremist involvement in her past. They'd built what appeared to be a healthy family despite the complicated circumstances of their backgrounds. "I'd be honored to attend," Sarah replied, surprising herself with how easily the words came. "Tell me about your fiancé, about your plans, about what you've been doing with your life." The conversation lasted nearly an hour, with Patricia describing her work as a social worker specializing in helping families affected by extremist recruitment. She'd grown up understanding that people could make terrible choices and still deserve opportunities for redemption, that communities could be wounded and still find ways to heal, that families could be broken and still discover new ways to connect. "My parents always said you were the strongest person they knew," Patricia told her. "They said you made impossible choices and lived with the consequences because you understood that some things were more important than personal comfort. I've tried to build my life around that same kind of strength." The wedding took place in a small church in Ohio, surrounded by people who'd built lives of service and contribution despite complicated pasts. Sarah sat in the third row, watching her niece exchange vows with a young man who worked for a non-profit organization that provided job training to formerly incarcerated individuals. The ceremony was simple but profound, representing hope and commitment and the possibility of creating beauty from broken materials. Danny approached her after the ceremony, looking older but healthier than she remembered, his face carrying the peace that came from accepting responsibility and making amends. "Thank you for coming," he said simply. "Patricia wanted you here, and I wanted to tell you that I understand now why you made the choices you made. I'm grateful that you put protecting innocent people ahead of protecting us from the consequences of our actions." They spoke for only a few minutes, acknowledging the gulf that still existed between them while recognizing the respect that had grown in place of the anger and resentment that had once defined their relationship. They would never be close in the way siblings sometimes were, but they were no longer enemies. They were simply people who'd made different choices and learned to live with the results. 30 years later, the documentary crew had come to Sarah's Virginia home to film what they described as a legacy interview for a project about domestic terrorism prevention and community resilience. She sat in her living room, surrounded by books about criminal justice and community development, photographs from her FBI career, and awards recognizing her contributions to national security and public safety. Looking back over your career, the interviewer asked, "What would you say was your greatest achievement as FBI director?" Sarah considered the question, while watching sunlight filter through the windows of the home she'd built in retirement, filled with the kind of peaceful quiet that came from a life well lived, despite its complications and costs. "The attacks that never happened," she said finally. "The communities that found constructive ways to address their problems instead of destructive ones. The families that stayed together because we identified and addressed vulnerabilities before they could be exploited." The interviewer pressed for more specific examples, and Sarah found herself talking about Millbrook and dozens of similar communities where federal investment and attention had helped create alternatives to despair and resentment. She described programs that had become national models, policies that had been adopted by law enforcement agencies around the world, approaches that had fundamentally changed how societies thought about preventing rather than just responding to domestic terrorism. "But the cost was personal," the interviewer noted. "You sacrificed your family relationships to serve your professional responsibilities. Do you have any regrets about those choices?" Sarah felt the weight of 30 years, reflection in her response. "I regret that the situation required those choices to be made. I regret that my family members made decisions that put them in conflict with their community's safety and well-being. But I don't regret prioritizing the protection of innocent lives over the preservation of relationships that had already been damaged by choices I couldn't control." She gestured toward a photograph on the mantelpiece. Patricia's wedding picture, which included 3 generations of the Chen family who'd found ways to build constructive lives despite their complicated history. "But I've learned that families can be rebuilt in unexpected ways," that redemption is possible even after terrible mistakes, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is hold people accountable for choices that hurt others. The documentary would air the following year, as part of a series about leadership during crisis and the personal costs of public service. Sarah watched it once, noting how the filmmakers had balanced the personal drama with the larger policy implications, how they'd presented her story as both individual tragedy and institutional success. Sarah Chen died peacefully in her sleep at the age of 78, surrounded by colleagues who'd become friends, former agents who'd maintained contact across decades, and Patricia's children, grandchildren by marriage who'd grown up calling her Aunt Sarah, and understanding that their family history included both terrible mistakes and eventual redemption. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by her work, families who'd been protected from terrorist attacks they'd never known were planned, communities that had found constructive paths forward during times of economic hardship, former extremists who'd been helped to rebuild their lives through programs she'd championed. The eulogies focused on her professional achievements, the attacks prevented, the communities protected, the policies that had made America safer through understanding rather than just enforcement. But they also acknowledged the personal costs she'd accepted in service of those achievements, the relationships sacrificed, and the loneliness endured, because she'd understood that some responsibilities transcended personal comfort. Patricia delivered the final eulogy, speaking as someone who'd grown up understanding that strength sometimes required impossible choices, and that love sometimes demanded difficult decisions. Aunt Sarah taught us that leadership means accepting responsibility for the hardest choices, even when those choices cost you the things you care about most, she said. She showed us that serving others sometimes requires sacrificing personal happiness, but that such sacrifice can create legacies that outlast individual lives. The service concluded with a reading from the FBI motto, "Fidelity, Bravery, Integrity." Sarah had embodied those values throughout her career, but she'd also expanded their meaning to include compassion, understanding, and the recognition that effective law enforcement required building communities rather than just investigating crimes. Her gravestone bore a simple inscription, Sarah Chen, 1975 to 2053, FBI Director, 2024 to 2039. She chose duty over comfort, service over safety, and the protection of many over the approval of few. But the real memorial to her life was visible in communities across America that had learned to address their problems constructively rather than destructively, in families that had been helped through difficult times, instead of being torn apart by extremist recruitment, in young people who'd grown up with opportunities for contribution rather than grievances about exclusion. Millbrook thrived as a model of rural revitalization, its community center bearing a plaque that read, "In honor of Sarah Chen, who showed us that hope is stronger than hate, that construction is more powerful than destruction, and that the best way to honor our past is to build a better future." The domestic terrorism prevention programs she'd pioneered had been adopted by law enforcement agencies around the world, credited with preventing thousands of attacks and protecting millions of lives. Academic courses studied her leadership during a crisis, her ability to balance personal pain with professional responsibility, her understanding that effective security required addressing root causes rather than just immediate symptoms. But perhaps her most important legacy was visible in the ordinary lives of people who'd found constructive ways to deal with their problems, because institutions had learned to serve them effectively, communities that had remained strong because they'd received attention and investment when they needed it most, families that had stayed together because vulnerabilities had been addressed before they could be exploited. Subscribe to our channel where silence is never forgotten.